used to be an intern at a large mega church in Albuquerque, New Mexico. We would do our Easter sunrise services in the football stadium. And, the whole city came out. It seemed the place was packed. And the pastor's habit was to begin the Easter sunrise service on Easter Sunday morning by saying, "Welcome and Merry Christmas." What would follow would be some nervous laughter, it being Easter and all. And then he would say, "I say Merry Christmas because I know that most of you I won't see again until Christmas Eve." It is true that there's a sentiment that Christmas and Easter are inextricably linked. Christmas is the celebration of God becoming man. My family does Advent. We do it with our two young kids. And every night at our Advent time, I ask them, what is Christmas the celebration of? And the older one, Madison, always tells me it's that God became a man. And my next question is, why did God have to become a man? And she says, so that he could die for sinners. In some sense, Christmas and Easter are linked in that we celebrate Christmas not simply because God became a man, but because that leads to something else. It leads to his death. Even the wise men understood this. The wise men showed up at Jesus's, birth, his baby shower, if you will, bringing burial spices, which is not a politically correct gift to bring to a baby shower. If I were to show up at a baby shower with a casket, you would think that strange. And my answer, hey, kids are going to die anyway. That's not an appropriate answer. And you would drive me out, rightly so. Yet the wise men show up with burial spices to Jesus' birth. And that's treated as good news. Why is it good news that Jesus would die? And the answer is because through his death, he makes a way for sinners to be saved. The grave can't hold him down. He rules over the grave. And that's not a news flash that just, it wasn't breaking news at his resurrection that he rules over the grave. He had said that throughout his ministry. Time and time again, he had claimed the authority over death. He rules death, not the other way around. Death does not rule him. And we see that most clearly this morning in Mark 5. Mark 5 is where Jesus stakes his claim of authority over the domain of death. And let's be honest here, it's a few days before Christmas. Mark is a difficult place to be before Christmas because Mark is the least Christmassy of all of the Gospels. I'm sure you noticed, but there's no angels in the manger in Mark. There's no shepherds. There's no wise men from the east bringing gifts to Jesus in the Gospel of Mark. There's not even a manger in Mark. Mark skips over the childhood of Jesus, the flight to Egypt, nothing said about him being a carpenter, nothing at all. In Mark's gospel, there's no Old Testament prophecies about Jesus even. Mark begins with one Old Testament prophecy about John the Baptist. And he's just introduced to usher you right to the baptism of Jesus Christ. We're introduced to Jesus in the Gospel of Mark as the one being baptized and declared from heaven that he is God's son. And that's what launches us into Mark. And Mark is really like a roller coaster with one car after another, and each subsequent car, each subsequent corner, more stunning than the one before. I mean, think of everything that's been linked together so far through Mark. It begins with a voice from heaven declaring that Jesus is God's son. And that's immediately followed with Jesus going toe-to-toe with the devil in the wilderness 40 days without sinning. Then he goes to a synagogue where he begins teaching in a synagogue, and somebody stands up and starts screaming at him in the synagogue, and he rebukes him and casts a demon out of him. From there, he goes to Peter's mother-in-law's house where he miraculously heals her. Then he goes back to a different house where a man is lowered through the roof, and he heals that man. Then he forgives a wicked sinner of his sins, stunning everybody. Then he goes toe-to-toe with the scribes and the Pharisees, and he, conquers them by declaring that he is the one who made the universe. Then he proves that he's the creator by creating a man with a withered hand, creating a new hand in him without even so much as lifting a finger. Then he goes out into the sea, and he stops the wind and the waves, stills the hurricane. Then he goes onto the shore and again goes toe-to-toe with a man filled with thousands of demons, casts the demons out, and the man is found at Jesus' feet, clothed and in his right mind. From there, he crosses the sea again to the passage where we are right now. He gets off the boat and finds himself surrounded by a crowd. He begins teaching and interacting with the crowd. A notable man, a synagogue leader, Jairus, came to Jesus. Everybody would have known Jairus. Jairus throws himself at Jesus' feet and begs Jesus to go to his house to heal his 12-year-old daughter, and Jesus agrees. And on the way to Jairus' house, a woman comes up and touches Jesus' robe, grabs onto the back of Jesus' robe, and is miraculously healed. Do you see how this is one stunning event after another? And every event is more miraculous, it seems, than the one before it. And you can say that about the entire Gospel of Mark. It's one after another all the way to the end. He never lets up. And that's true this morning. The miracle we're going to see this morning is probably the most miraculous of all of them so far. Remember, the context here is Jesus is off the boat. The crowd is there. The nobleman Jairus asks Jesus to go to his house and heal his daughter, and Jesus agrees. They're on their way. The woman grabs Jesus' coat, and Jesus stops. Time is of the essence. Jairus' daughter is dying, and Jesus stops. He's not hurried. He stops and ministers to this woman. At that point, people come and tell Jairus' daughter is dead, and the question we ended with last week is, does Jairus have the kind of faith that can withstand this trial, the death of his daughter? Does he have the kind of faith that can withstand that? Keep in mind that all of Jesus' miracles are his self-revelation. Every time Jesus does a miracle, it's not simply, for some tangential reason. He always does his miracles to show us who he is. He'll often make a claim and back it up with a miracle. Earlier in Mark, he said he was the creator. He backed it up by creating a new hand in a man. He says he rules nature. He backs it up by stopping the wind and the waves. He says he rules the demons even. He backs that up by casting out demons. Well, now he's going to say he rules the grave, and he's going to back that up by resurrecting someone. All of his miracles are the verification of his person by his power, and they always show us his consummate empathy. He's powerful, and he has pity on us. He's the creator, and he has care for his creation. He's eternal, and yet he gives us empathy. He loves us and cares for us. His unparalleled power is matched only by his unparalleled compassion on us. And this story highlights that perfectly. But beyond that, this particular story, this particular miracle, stakes Jesus' claim over death. It shows that he is claiming to be superior over the grave. He's saying that the grave works for him, not the other way around. And in this passage, he foreshadows the fate of all of those who would ever believe in him. For the context here, remember, this is a story about two women and two miracles. Both opposites, both women opposites. One rich, the other poor. One from a powerful family, the other anonymous. One elite, the other forgotten. One doted on in her sickness, the other abandoned in her sickness. One with the family connections to summon Jesus to her bedside in her illness. The other with no connections at all, can't even approach Jesus from the front, has to sneak up from behind. One a child, the other a social outcast. One 12 years old, the other dying for 12 years. In some sense, they're opposites, but in another sense, they make the same point. God is not a respecter of persons. Money can only buy so much. All of Jairus' money and influence and social status could not purchase his daughter's health. Death and sickness come to landlords and tenants both, to the rich and the poor, to the owners and the employees both. In fact, it was J.C. Ryle who wrote this, quote, "We often talk as if the possession of riches was the great antidote to sorrow, and as if money could secure us from sickness and death. There is far more equality in the portions appointed to men than at first sight appears." We left the scene last week with a question hanging over Jairus. Will his faith endure the loss of his daughter? Before we answer that question, notice how this whole encounter has already started to show Jesus' authority over death by how he handled the situation. He reoriented precedence. He made himself the priority in this situation. Both of these women had needs. Whose need is more pressing? We're neutral observers here. We don't know either of these two women. We're not related to any of them. We don't have friends. We're not friends with any of them. Which of their two needs is more pressing and more urgent? Certainly the 12-year-old girl at home, right? I mean, she literally dies in this story. The other lady's been dying for 12 years. She can wait 15 more minutes. But Jesus is not racing against the clock. He's not running to her house to beat death. He has his own priorities. He has his own priorities. His delay obviously cost this girl her life. He was on his way to her house to save her, to heal her. This other woman touches his robe, and Jesus stops everything. Calls the woman forward and has her confess her faith in Jesus Christ before everybody. And then it says she goes on explaining the whole truth about Jesus. Then Jesus stops and he talks for a considerable amount of time. Verse 35, well, he was still speaking. That Greek phrase, well, he was still speaking, implies this has been going on for a long time. It must have been several hours at least, because in the meantime, Jairus' daughter has died. The funeral progression has started. Messengers came. The funeral was obviously able to get underway, and messengers came to find Jairus. There's hours that have gone by here. And Jesus is spending hours in the street teaching this woman and the crowd the priority of faith. And the longer he's teaching about faith in him as the Messiah, the more agitated, I'm sure, Jairus is getting. I mean, doesn't Jesus know that his daughter is at home dying? That every sentence he says, she's closer to death? What's the slowdown here? Where's the rush? Come on. And he's forced to rein in the proverbial horses there. Jesus pulls the whole circus to the side of the road, the whole caravan here. I mean, this was quite an entourage. A massive crowd, the disciples, Jairus and his accompaniment, and he stops everything to teach this woman and the crowd about faith. Jesus made his teaching the priority over this little girl's healing, which is another way of saying Jesus made himself the priority. He took precedence over the sick girl. In Jesus' mind, it was a higher priority to teach everybody the importance of faith in him as the Messiah than it was to go save this girl. But now the tension comes because the messengers have arrived from Jairus' house and have told Jairus his daughter is dead. Look at the language Mark uses, verse 35. When Jesus was still speaking, they, the dismissive way Mark deals with them, they came from the house of the synagogue official, saying, your daughter has died. Notice there's just rude bluntness to him. Your daughter's dead. You can tell they were agitated. They didn't want him to go seek out Jesus. I mean, he left his daughter's deathbed to go find Jesus. Clearly against their counsel. He goes and throws himself at the mercy of Jesus, and his daughter dies in his absence. You almost get the note of, I told you so in these synagogue messengers' voices, don't you? Your daughter's dead. Why bother the teacher any longer? Notice the dismissive way they refer to Jesus now. Why bother the teacher? You know, he's not a healer right now. Notice that Jesus was known for his teaching more than his healing, firstly. But secondly, notice they're saying, look, he can't heal. He wants to stop in the middle of the road and just teach for hours on end. Leave him here teaching. Leave the teacher, let him teach. Let's get out of here and go be with your wife. Let's go home. Forget Jesus and his teaching. He's powerless to save your daughter. In their mind, the health of the girl trumps theology, and they don't have patience for Jesus and his teaching. Well, verse 36, but Jesus, overhearing what was spoken. That word overhearing it's a powerful word in the Greek. I know a lot of times you can milk meaning out of Greek words and go too far and start making things up. This is not one of those cases. The word here for overhearing, we don't have a similar word in English. It's the word that means to hear alongside of. It means in one hand to overhear something that wasn't meant for you. So in that sense, overhearing works in English, and the NAS translates it overhearing. But there's a connotation to it in the Greek. It not only means to hear something that wasn't meant for you, but it means to hear something that wasn't meant for you that you then show is untrue by the way that you ignore it. So an English example might be, you're walking around the corner and you hear two people saying something negative about your family or about your wife or your husband or your kids or whatever. And you walk around. It wasn't meant for your ears, but you heard it. Well, you decide not to respond. You're going to show how untrue it is what they said by just walking right through the middle of their conversation. Just walk right through the middle, ignoring them. They'll obviously see that you heard, and they'll obviously see that you're not dignifying it with a response. You're saying what they said is untrue just by the nature of ignoring it. Greek has a word for that, which I think is pretty cool. They have an actual word for that. This is that word. Jesus hears what the messengers say to Jairus. Remember, Jesus is not talking to Jairus. He's talking to the woman, and the crowd is hearing. Jairus is on the side getting more and more antsy. The messengers come to him and say, your daughter's dead. Jesus overhears that. He ignores it. He doesn't dignify it with a response. He shows that what they say shouldn't even be heeded at all, just by ignoring it. Instead, he looks directly at Jairus and tells him, do not be afraid any longer. Only believe. The tense of those two words in Greek means they're both happening at the same time. Jairus right now is afraid and he believes. He has faith and he has fear. They're both in his heart. They're both fighting it out in his heart. They're both ripping his heart apart. And the question is, which one is going to carry the day? It should be encouraging to us to remember, to see here that you can have faith and fear simultaneously. Being afraid of something, being shocked at the death of your daughter doesn't mean you don't have faith. They both exist simultaneously in the person's heart. Jairus has fear. He's shattered. His world has just been rocked because of his daughter's death. But he also has faith in Jesus as the Messiah. And Jesus looks directly at him and he says, don't fear anymore. Only believe. With majestic calmness, Jesus looks right into Jairus' soul. Says, don't be afraid. Notice that the antidote to fear here is to trust in the goodness and the sovereignty of God. Jesus refuses to lend an ear to the heralds of doom. Instead, he tells Jairus, just believe that I'm good and that I'm in control. Keep on believing. Keep on believing, Jairus. Notice that faith isn't something that Jairus has. Faith is something that has Jairus here. It's got him in its grips. His faith will carry him from despair to hope. Well, what kind of faith should he have is the implicit question here. The answer is the same kind of faith the woman has, the same kind of faith they've been talking about for hours in the streets. Jesus wasn't wasting his time here. He was giving a picture to everybody about what real faith looks like. He was preparing Jairus for the day the trials would come. He was preparing him for the day the trials would knock on his door and burst into his soul. And that's exactly what's happened here. And he has been exquisitely prepared by the Master. For hours, he's just heard a lesson on faith. And now Jesus says, put your fear aside, only believe. Notice that Jesus is not telling Jairus' daughter isn't really dead. He's not saying the messengers are wrong, the messengers are lying. He's not telling Jairus, believe in the resurrection. He's not saying those things. Nobody has brought up the idea of a resurrection yet. When Jesus tells Jairus, don't be afraid, only believe, he's not telling him, believe that she's going to be raised from the dead. He's telling her, believe that I am good and that I am in control. That's all. And that's the antidote to fear. Notice the priority in this is the faith in Jesus over any circumstance. It doesn't matter the trial. It does something extreme as the daughter's death here. That's not the priority. The priority is faith in Jesus Christ. Verse 37, Jesus allowed no one to accompany him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James, presumably Jairus and his entourage as well. Notice that Jesus leaves the crowd behind now. He leaves the crowd behind. How does he leave the crowd behind? How does he get them to stay? Jesus has a persuasive personality, believe me. He tells everybody to stay. They stay. They listen to him. He also leaves them 9 of the 12 disciples to keep the interaction going and to entertain the conversation longer. I feel like the crowd got cheated. They got left with Judas and Jesus took John. They got the short end of that deal. Jesus takes 3 of the 12, James, John, and Peter. Why did he choose those 3? Jesus has this inner circle that he takes with him often. This inner circle sees many of Jesus' most significant miracles. They see the transfiguration. They're with Jesus in the garden while he's praying. They're going to see this miracle. These are the three that Jesus is pouring into. Sometimes Andrew is considered part of this group. Jesus is playing favorites. He can do that. He's Jesus. Why does he choose these three? Well, they're his most beloved disciples, but he's also preparing them. James is going to be the first martyr. Peter is the first leader. John is probably the most significant of the 12, the one that Jesus loved the most. He wrote 5 books in the New Testament. That's John, persecuted severely for his faith. Both Peter and John were put in prison early in the book of Acts for their faith. Jesus is preparing them for that. He's giving them special teaching to prepare James to die first, Peter to lead first, and John to have the most significant life of all of them. He's pouring into these three right now for the day that he will leave them. He pours into them, takes them with him. He wants them to see what's around the next corner. What's the destination of their walk? Jesus is on his way to redefine death. He's on his way to redefine death. Verse 38, they came to the house of the synagogue official. They arrive at Jairus' house. And he saw a commotion and people loudly weeping and wailing. It's difficult to understand this because it's so far removed from our own funerals. Think of a Western Americanized funeral. First of all, you wear your best clothes, right? You get a black suit, crisp white shirt, nice tie. If you don't have a tie, borrow one. You show up dressed sharply. You're quiet. There's probably a sign that says, "Quiet, please," right outside the funeral home. Every funeral home I've been in has that sign, "Quiet, please." You wear sunglasses in case a tear escapes, nobody can see. You speak in hushed tones, quiet sobbing. Arms around each other, patting, they're there. Maybe even an open mic where you share nice stories about the person's life and you all remember him fondly. That's how our funerals are. Have you ever seen a funeral in the Near East or the Middle East? On TV maybe? They're not that way. They're yelling and screaming and shrieking and wailing. Screaming women at the top of their lungs is more than appropriate at one of these funerals. Violent sobbing and shouts from men is part and parcel with this affair. In the ancient Near East and Israel at this time, they would rip their clothes at the funeral. Not just the family, everybody there would rip their clothes. So you wouldn't wear your nicest suit. You would wear something that was okay to get holes in. You would rip your clothes, you would wail and moan and scream and yell. The Mishnah, which is the Jewish description of how the law applies to life, this very elaborate book of rules and prescriptions for Jewish life, has 30 plus restrictions on how you're supposed to tear your clothes at a funeral. Everybody's supposed to tear their clothes, firstly. Secondly, your tear has to be at least 5 inches long, big enough for you to put a fist through. You are allowed to pre-tear your clothes at home, but you have to stitch them up with a thin thread to make it easier to tear in the right spot when you get to the funeral. This is just their etiquette. You'd leave your clothes torn for a certain period of time if you were a family member for, up to a week. If you just kind of knew the guy a few days, if you were just an acquaintance, you could change your clothes and you went home. You'd wear an undergarment over it so you'd be modest. There's descriptions about where in the clothes the rip is supposed to be. There's also supposed to be flute players at the funeral. Why the flute? Because it's a dissonant instrument. Why at least 2 flute players? You had to have at least 2. Why at least 2 flute players? Because if 2 flute players play dissonant notes, it clashes against each other. It creates almost a horrific sound. The Mishnah says that even the most poor peasant at his funeral is required to be 2 paid flute players and 1 paid wailing woman. There's professionals involved in this, even at a poor person's funeral. Remember, at least 2 flutes so that you have the dissonance. Those are the rules. Well, Jairus is not poor. This place would be crazy packed with all these flute players and professional wailers and mourners. They would have been circling like vultures at news of the girl's death, and they just cascade into the house. I mean, he's very, very wealthy. This is a payday for them. This place would be packed to the hilt with all these professional weepers and wailers and dissonant flutes clashing, women shrieking, men screaming, clothes being ripped. This is pure chaos and bedlam that Jesus walks into here. This is a cacophony. This is pandemonium. He sees a commotion, Mark says. That's putting it mildly. weeping and wailing. And Jesus, verse 39, enters in and he says to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep?" How do you answer that question if you're a professional mourner? For the money, I guess? What do you mean? Why do I do this? "The child has not died," Jesus said, "but is only asleep." Well, what is that? They had a dirge and dance that was their doleful commentary on death, and Jesus steps into it and says, "She's not permanently dead. She's sleeping." That would be funny to them. In fact, they laugh. You see in the next verse. They laughed at him, which shows the, sincerity of their mourning a few seconds earlier. They can put those tears aside and just roll over and laugh at her when Jesus starts saying she's not really dead. I mean, these people knew death. They knew that she was dead. They're professionals. Jesus is not saying, by the way, that you wrongly diagnosed her. He's not saying, oh, she's just in a kind of coma. It's an understandable mistake. I could see how that would look like death, but just put these spices under her nose and she'll come right to. That's not what he's saying. He's redefining death for them. He's telling them death is not permanent. It's more like sleeping. It's more like a nap. He's redefining death. When you go to sleep, you close your eyes. You wake up a little bit later, 20 minutes later, 2 hours later, if you have a newborn at home, 8 hours later. The world was going on the whole time. You were just out, you wake up, and you're back in it. Right away, there you are. That's Jesus' analogy to death. It's more like that than being done. It's a little nap. You close your eyes and you come back to. And with these words, Jesus redefines death. And that's not just true for the daughters of synagogue leaders. That's true of every death. Death is not the end for us. It's a time out. You close your eyes and you open them up again later. That's how every death is. And the New Testament authors pick up on this. Do you notice that in the rest of the New Testament, when Christians die, they refer to it as falling asleep in Jesus? They're just out of it for a little while. They'll be back. It's like they went to sleep. What a great analogy for death, isn't it? Paul writes that we live our lives enslaved to the fear of death. And as much as that's true, we are enslaved to a master who's a liar, to a ghost, to a shadow. It's not a real master. He doesn't really rule us. Death isn't final. That's not the enemy's trump card. The devil holds us in the fear of death because the devil's a liar and makes us think it's the end and that's all there is. That's not true. Listen, when you die, your soul is immediately in the presence of the Lord. Come what will to your body. Your body could be cremated, destroyed, sawed in half like Isaiah's plunged into the sea. It doesn't matter what happens to it, buried and eaten by worms. That's not the point. The point is that Jesus will make you a new body. And your eyes will open in your resurrected body and you will be back on this earth, back in the game again. That's what death is. It's not final. Well, Jesus tells them that. And they laugh. So, verse 40, Jesus doesn't take their derision well. He throws them all out, putting them all out. How does Jesus clear them all out? Well, the same way he got the crowd to stay behind. The same way he clears out the temple twice in his ministry. He throws all the Jewish leaders out of the temple. He can throw professional wailers out of a funeral. He is just a stunning leader here, a stunning personality. He throws them all out. They listen, they go. He takes along the child's father and mother and his own companions. This is another reason he only took 3 of the disciples, just space restrictions here. They enter the room where the child was. Jesus is about to make this little girl a picture of what all of our deaths are like. Nothing with her is particular to her. Just the timing of it is particular. It happens sooner than you would expect, but so did her death. This is a picture of what will happen to all of us. He goes up to her bedside, verse 41, taking the child by the hand. Just notice the compassion of our Lord here. Taking her by her hand, just so gentle, pastoral, taking her by her hand. He says to her, Talitha cum, which is in Aramaic. Why does Mark give us the Aramaic of this? these people spoke both Greek and Aramaic. Everybody in Israel then spoke Aramaic and Greek both. Their conversations were probably mixed back and forth. Who knows if the whole conversation was in Greek and Jesus just used these words in Aramaic, or if the whole conversation was in Aramaic and Mark translated it all into Greek except this word. Whether it was Jesus or Mark, whoever it was, they kept this word in Aramaic. Why didn't they translate that to Greek too? Because, like that earlier we talked about, this is one of those words that can't be translated into another language very well. There's not one word in Greek that captures this. It's like an English idiom. In English you would say, my precious little girl, Talitha, my precious little one. It's not something you would say to a baby, and it's not something you would say to a 13-year-old either. It's my little tiny girl, my precious tiny girl. In English you might say, my little lamb, or sweetheart, Talitha. Just look at the gentle way Jesus speaks to her. Talitha, cum, means come back, arise, stand up, come back to us. Talitha, cum. With those gentle, kind words, his voice reaches down into death, and his words and his authority grab this little girl's soul and bring her back to her body. Talitha cum. Immediately, verse 42, the girl got up and began to walk. She came back to life. Are you astonished by the almost simple way Jesus does this? Elisha had a resurrection in the Old Testament. So did Elijah, very similar. Little kids that had died, they both bring them back to life, but very, very different than this. Remember, Elijah lays on top of the boy and does like snow angels on top of him, waving his arms and his legs back and forth, pleading with God for the boy to come back to life. Elisha lays on top of that child too and is breathing into his mouth, pleading with God for life to come back to the body. Look at the effortless way that Jesus does this. Just takes her hand, Talitha cum, and she's back alive again. This is clear demonstration that Jesus has authority over the grave. It's a clear piece of evidence that Jesus is the Lord. This is a fulfillment of what Hannah says in 1 Samuel 2, where Hannah writes, Yahweh kills and makes alive. He brings down to Sheol and he raises up. Yahweh makes poor and makes rich. He brings low and he exalts. Do you see how all of that is fulfilled in this story here? It's Jesus that makes this girl alive. His delay brought her to death. His words bring her to life. It's Jesus that lays low the proud. Jesus humbled Jairus through this story. It's Jesus that raises up the humble. His words raised up the anonymous woman, raised her up and gave her the dignity that her faith deserved. Jesus humbled and he exalted. This story not only proves Hannah true, it proves the deity of Jesus Christ as well. Mark uses Talitha just to show the gentle way Jesus does this. Then she walks around. She was 12 years old, another way of drawing her connection to the woman who had been suffering in the streets for 12 years. They're opposites, but they're both made whole by Jesus. And then look at the end of verse 43. He then said that something should be given to her to eat. Look at the compassion of Jesus, even here. This woman had been sick. This girl had been sick for several days. She probably hadn't eaten in multiple days before she died. She would be famished here. She's fully healthy. She can eat now. She's fully restored is the point here. Nobody else, believe me, nobody else in that room was concerned about her appetite at this point. Nobody was thinking, wow, I bet she's really hungry. And Jesus cares for even this kind of little need. He sees the forest, he sees the trees. Give her some food. Well, what do you even say? Look at these people. Immediately, verse 42, they were completely astounded. I would think so. In Greek, it's two infinitives, astounded, astounded, put on top of each other. We don't speak like that in English. It's astonished by astonishment. Overwhelmed by overwhelmingness. Terrified by terror. Feared by fear. That's how you'd say it in English. And this is becoming the pattern with Jesus. Everywhere he goes, this is the effect he's having on people. Have you noticed? On the boat, he leaves the disciples terrified about who he is. In the land of Herasenes, he leaves the crowd petrified with fear because he can control the demons. He leaves the audience terrified by the fact that he healed this woman. Here he's leaving everybody in the room completely astounded, bewildered about his authority. How could they possibly begin to explain this to anybody? Well, Jesus solves that dilemma. Verse 43, he gave them strict orders that no one should know about this. Are you kidding me? By saying this, Jesus is recalibrating evangelism. He's recalibrating evangelism. No one should know about this. I mean, that is funny. Let me tell you what's about to happen here. Jesus and James and Peter and John are going to walk down the stairs. They're going to walk past the girl's extended family hanging out in the living room. They're going to walk out the front door where all the funeral crowd is. They're going to walk out onto the streets through the mourners they had thrown out named moments earlier. Don't make eye contact. Don't make eye contact. Everybody's going to have one question. When does the funeral start again? When do we get this show back on the road? That's what everybody is going to be thinking. And Jesus tells the parents, don't tell anyone. Okay. What? Nothing to see here. Please disperse. Oh, this is my daughter? Don't mind her. I mean, what do you mean, don't tell anyone? Moreover, 2 Kings 7 says it's a sin to have good news and not proclaim it. Well, Jesus is recalibrating what constitutes good news here. He's recalibrating evangelism. He makes this a pattern through Mark. Over and over and over again, he tells people, he'll do a miracle and say, don't tell anyone. He'll heal someone and say, don't tell anyone. He'll cast demons out of someone and say, don't tell anyone. Why not? Because this is not the message he wants us to proclaim. The message that he gives us is not one of healing. We're not supposed to go in the world telling everybody that Jesus is a healer. The message isn't even so much his teaching. The message that we are given to take outside the walls of the church, to take to the world, is simply this: that Jesus died on the cross, bearing our punishment for sins, and he rose again on the third day. And if you believe that, you can be saved from your sin. That's the only message we have. All through Mark, don't tell anyone, don't tell anyone, don't tell anyone, until the resurrection, the cross and the resurrection. Then he says, go into all the world and tell everyone. Then it's the Great Commission. We're not tasked to go in the world telling everyone that God can heal them, that God can give them a better life. Notice how easy it is to get sidetracked and distracted from the one message we have to take to the world. It's so easy to try to make converts in the world of politics, to win people over to our political view, or to make converts about social justice, to get people more concerned about particular issues that we're passionate about. That's not the message we have to bring to the world. The one message we have is that Jesus died on behalf of sinners, bearing our penalty on his cross. And that he rose from the grave because he is stronger than death. And if you believe that, you can be saved. That's what we're supposed to go in the world and say. And that's the message of Christmas. That's why Christmas brings us joy. It's not that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, although that's true. It's not that God became a man, although that's also true. Christmas doesn't fill us with so much joy because Jesus was born to a virgin, also true though. Christmas fills us with joy because God became a man so that he could die, and he died so that he could make a way for sinners to be saved. That's why we proclaim tidings of peace between God and man, because Jesus' death makes that peace possible. Well, this is the end of Mark 5, which, like I said, has got to be one of the most fascinating and powerful and captivating chapters in all of the Bible. There's three figures in Mark 5, really. The man plagued by demons confined to the grave, the woman bleeding in the middle of the road, and the little girl dead on her bed. All three of them unclean. Jesus restores all three of them by taking their uncleanliness on himself and giving them life through faith. That is the message, that his death takes our sin, and through repentance and faith, we can have life through him. Lord, we're thankful that you triumph over the grave. We're thankful that you came to earth as a king and that you are coming again as a returning and conquering king. That you will come back to this world and take your people, that where you are, we may be as well. Lord, we're thankful for even the hope that death is not the end, it's just a pause. And that you will resurrect us, that there is life after death because you rose from the grave. We're thankful for the truth of the gospel message that there is everlasting life to all who would believe. We give you thanks for this in Jesus' name. Amen.